The Outlast series has always traded in secrets. Murkoff Corporation operates in shadows, conducting experiments that official records deny ever happened. Red Barrels deliberately withholds information, understanding that what you cannot see clearly is more disturbing than what gets shown in full light. This is a big reason a lot of the game franchise literally takes place in the dark. The Outlast Trials takes this approach further. Set in 1959 at Sinyala facility, it shows you trials without explaining their ultimate purpose. It introduces the Skinner Man without clarifying whether he is hallucination or something worse. It ends with reagents believing they escaped, while suggesting that escape might be another layer of programming they will never consciously recognize. Beneath the trials and the prime assets and the pharmaceutical conditioning, there are questions the game never fully answers. Mysteries that persist even after you complete every objective. These mysteries are not accidents. They are not oversights in the storytelling. They are deliberate gaps in your understanding. Carefully constructed absences designed to make you question what you know and what Murkoff wants you to believe. This works on the gamer in an almost meta sense. In this video, we are going to examine every major mystery in the Outlast Trials. We will explore the Skinner Man and why he wears Easterman's face. We will trace the escaped reagent who may or may not have existed. We will diagnose Easterman's paranoia and discover who has been poisoning him. We will uncover Vernika's true intentions and why he has been grooming Easterman as Sinyala's ultimate weapon. We will decode the trigger phrase and understand what it activates inside completed reagents. We will walk through each rebirth ending and trace how they connect to Mount Massive Asylum and the Walrider. By the end, you will understand that the biggest mystery in the Outlast Trials is not what Murkoff did to their victims, but what they are still doing, and why the programming never stops even after you think you have escaped. This analysis and interpretation of the Outlast Trials is just my take on things. Everything you are about to hear represents commentary on the game's themes, narrative structure, and psychological concepts, exploring what Red Barrels created and what it reveals about institutional control and consciousness manipulation. If you find something in this video that resonated, drop a comment letting me know, or if you have a different take on a certain part, let me know. You can also throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. Now let's get comfortable, dim the lights, and get started. Chapter 1. The Skinner Man. When your torturer becomes your god. The first time you see the Skinner Man, you are in the mansion tutorial. The pusher has just released psychosis gas into your face. Your vision distorts. Colors bleed into each other. And then he appears. A figure in a black suit rising from the floor like smoke taking shape. His head morphs into something that should not exist. A grotesque skull with 3 sets of glowing eyes. Teeth visible through torn flesh, tendrils extending from where his neck should be in an array of white and red and black. He moves toward you with impossible speed, his body contorting in ways that make your stomach turn. You run. You find an antidote. He sinks back through the floor, and you are left with a single burning question. What was that? The game provides documentation. Easterman's journals mention the Skinner Man phenomenon. He writes with indignation about a sleep-room observer who suggested the entity resembles him. Easterman finds this ridiculous. He views himself as a kind father to his patients, believes they love him as much as he respects them. The suggestion that this nightmare creature could be a reflection of him offends his self-perception so deeply that he dismisses the entire observation as absurd, but every reagent who experiences psychosis sees the same entity. They call him Dr. Skinner. The resemblance to Easterman is undeniable once you notice it. The suit, the general build, the way he stands. The Skinner Man is Easterman, distorted through a lens of terror and pharmaceutical hallucination into something demonic. Here is where the mystery deepens. The Skinner Man is described in documentation as a phantom-like entity, a thought form that manifests as an unexpected side effect of Project Lathe's mental conditioning. He is not supposed to exist. Murkoff did not design him. The trials were meant to break down reagents and rebuild them into programmable weapons. The Skinner Man represents something that emerged from that process without permission, a consequence that Easterman and his team cannot fully control or explain. The entity only appears during psychosis, when reagents lose sanity through exposure to hallucinogenic compounds, when their grip on reality loosens enough that the boundary between external world and internal nightmare collapses. The Skinner Man rises. He knows exactly where his victims are located. He cannot be fooled by hiding spots or misdirection. He phases through doors and obstacles, and when he gets close enough, he drains life from reagents through proximity alone, his presence causing physical harm through mechanisms that should not work if he were merely a hallucination. This creates the first major mystery. If the Skinner Man is a hallucination, why does he appear identically to every reagent? Individual hallucinations should reflect individual fears, personal traumas, the unique psychological landscape of each mind. But the Skinner Man is consistent across all subjects. Every reagent sees the same demon wearing Easterman's face. This suggests the hallucination has been implanted, programmed into subjects through the conditioning process itself. Think about what that means. Murkoff has found a way to standardize nightmares. They have identified techniques for installing specific hallucinatory content into human consciousness, ensuring that when chemical compounds disrupt normal perception, the mind generates predetermined images rather than random terror. The Skinner Man is not a side effect, he is a feature, an implanted psychological weapon that activates when reagents lose control. But why Easterman's face? Why would Murkoff program their subjects to hallucinate a demonic version of Project Lathe's director? The answer emerges when you examine how the Skinner Man functions psychologically. He represents authority transformed into inescapable punishment. Easterman's voice fills the sleep room, offering false comfort and paternal manipulation. His broadcasts tell reagents they are being improved, that suffering is necessary for growth, that compliance brings safety. The Skinner Man is what happens when you stop believing those lies. When the drugs destabilize your ability to accept Easterman's reframing, when you lose the mental grip that allows you to pretend the trials are training rather than torture, the Skinner Man appears as Easterman's true face. The loving father becomes the demon. The authority figure becomes the destroyer. This serves a specific purpose in the conditioning process. It creates psychological symmetry. Obey Easterman and receive chemical comfort. Resist and face the demonic version of the same authority. The message embeds itself beneath conscious thought. Easterman is both your salvation and your destruction. He is the only voice that matters. He defines reality. And when you can no longer maintain the cognitive dissonance required to see him as benevolent, his demonic form hunts you until you restore your grip on the acceptable narrative. The Skinner Man trains reagents to fear their own doubt. Every time psychosis triggers his appearance, every time chemical disruption allows you to see through the manipulation, you're punished by an unkillable entity. This conditions you to resist the very psychological states that might let you recognize what is being done to you. Clarity becomes dangerous. Questioning becomes lethal. The safest mental state is the one where you accept Easterman's lies completely, where you never lose enough sanity to trigger the hallucination that reveals his true nature. Several Murkoff staff members are aware of the Skinner Man's existence. Olivier Baranchik knows, Avallanos knows, Vernica knows. They discuss him in internal correspondence. They approve programs designed to amplify his effects. Skinner Man hallucinations combine with other psychological effects across unrelated reagents. This means Murkoff is not trying to eliminate the phenomenon. They are studying it, refining it, learning how to weaponize the implanted nightmare more effectively. But there is something else, something the documents hint at without stating explicitly. The Skinner Man's tendrils, the black, writhing extensions that emerge from his body during close encounters, bear resemblance to something that appears later in the Outlast timeline, the Walrider, the entity that Rudolf Wernicke will eventually create at Mount Massive Asylum. The Walrider manifests as a swarm of nanites controlled by human consciousness, appearing as dark tendrils and shadows that move with impossible speed and kill through proximity effects. The visual similarity is not coincidence, it is foreshadowing. The Skinner Man is a prototype, a thought form that demonstrates Murkoff can implant specific hallucinatory content into traumatized minds, content that manifests with consistent visual characteristics across multiple subjects. Wernicke is watching this phenomenon, and he is learning lessons that will eventually lead to his greatest and most horrifying achievement. The Walrider is not Murkoff's first attempt at creating consciousness-based weapons. The Skinner Man is. The difference is that the Skinner Man only exists inside drugged minds, while the Walrider will eventually achieve external manifestation. They are demons born from institutional torture, thought forms that emerge when human consciousness is systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to Murkoff's specifications. Here is where the mystery becomes deeply uncomfortable. The rebirth endings reveal that the Skinner Man plays a vital role in completed reagents. When subjects hear the trigger phrase, "Spider Eye Lamb," after finishing the conditioning process, the Skinner Man's influence becomes active even outside trials. In the Havana ending, a completed reagent sees Easterman's face in the window reflection moments before the screen goes black. In the Beijing ending, Easterman appears with Skinner Man tendrils extending from his body as he drags the reagent toward the door. In the morphogenic engine ending, the Skinner Man's black tendrils creep into the reagent's vision as Wernicke activates the experiment. The Skinner Man is not just a punishment for losing sanity during trials. He is the mechanism through which Murkoff maintains control over completed subjects in the field. The implanted hallucination becomes a permanent presence, dormant until activated by the trigger phrase. When that phrase is spoken, the Skinner Man awakens inside the reagent's consciousness. And whatever he does in that moment, whatever influence he exerts, transforms the subject into a weapon that will carry out Murkoff's objectives without conscious awareness of being controlled. This creates a prison that exists entirely inside your own mind. You cannot escape the Skinner Man by leaving Sinyala. You cannot remove him by destroying the facility, or killing Easterman, or exposing Murkoff's crimes. He lives inside the architecture of your consciousness now, embedded so deeply that he has become part of how your brain processes reality. The conditioning does not end when the trials stop. It continues forever, waiting for 3 words to activate a demon wearing your torturer's face. That is the true horror of the Skinner Man. He represents psychological colonization so complete that your own mind becomes enemy territory. The part of you that might resist, that might question authority, that might recognize manipulation, has been replaced by an implanted entity that activates to suppress those thoughts before they fully form. You think you are free. You believe you escaped. But Easterman's voice is still in your head. His face is still in your nightmares. And when Murkoff needs you to kill, the Skinner Man will ensure you comply. Easterman writes that he finds it ridiculous to think the Skinner Man could be a reflection of him. He sees himself as a kind father. He believes his patients love him. This delusion is telling. It reveals that Easterman does not understand the weapon he helped create. He cannot recognize that the Skinner Man is exactly what he looks like to people whose minds he is destroying. The loving father and the demon are the same person. The Skinner Man is not a distortion. He is clarity. He is what reagents see when the drugs stop working long enough for truth to surface. And the fact that Murkoff has learned to weaponize that truth, to turn it into a control mechanism that activates on command, represents the most sophisticated psychological horror in the game. They have not just broken you, they have convinced you that your own moments of clarity are hallucinations to be feared and suppressed. They have made you complicit in your own ongoing torture by training you to view resistance as insanity and obedience as mental health. The mystery of the Skinner Man is not what he is. The mystery is how Murkoff learned to implant him so precisely, and what that capability reveals about how deep the conditioning actually goes. If they can program specific hallucinations that manifest identically across multiple subjects, what else have they installed inside reagent consciousness without their awareness? What other triggers exist? What other entities wait dormant inside minds that believe they are free? We will return to the Skinner Man when we examine the rebirth endings and the connection to the Walrider. But for now, understand this. The demon rising from the floor is not the mystery. The mystery is that part of you welcomes him. Chapter 2. The Escaped Reagent. The person who never existed. There is a document hidden in the Sinyala facility that most players never find. It's buried in the Escape Fallout folder, marked as Emergency Alert. The text is brief and urgent. Unknown number of reagents have escaped into Sinyala facility. All security and staff on high alert. Extreme prejudice and lethal force authorized in the capture or death of escaping reagents. The phrasing is significant. Unknown number. Murkoff does not know how many subjects have breached containment. The facility that monitors everything, that tracks reagent vitals through implanted devices, that can locate subjects during trials with perfect accuracy, has lost count of how many people have escaped. This should be impossible. Either the escape is so recent that numbers have not been confirmed, or something has disrupted Murkoff's tracking systems in ways that should not be possible given their technological capabilities. But there is one specific document that we must look at. It's buried in the Escapist folder, detailing an interrogation conducted by Clyde Perry. Now, you know Perry isn't just a guard. He is Murkoff's collector. He is brutal, efficient, and notoriously good at breaking people. When Perry asks a question, reagents answer. In this document, Perry is interrogating a team of 3 reagents about their 4th member who escaped. He has the tracking data. He knows a 4th signal was with them in the trial. He demands to know where that person went. And here is where it gets terrifying. The team doesn't break. They are confused. They vehemently deny a 4th member ever existed. They insist they have always been a team of 3. Perry tortures them, pushes them past their breaking point, but their story never changes. They aren't protecting a friend. They genuinely do not remember this person existing. So, we have a paradox. Murkoff's tracking system says there were 4 people. The human witnesses swear there were only 3. Most players dismiss this as memory erasure. The idea that Murkoff just wiped the memory of the escapee. But I think the truth is actually the inverse. I don't think Murkoff erased a real person. I think Murkoff programmed them to see a ghost. Look at the timeline. This interrogation aligns with the approval of Program Geister. In German, Geister literally translates to ghosts. The program's stated goal is to study convergent hallucinatory therapy and unexpected side effects of the Skinner Man. Put these 2 pieces together. Murkoff wasn't just testing if they could make you see monsters. They were testing if they could make you see people. The 4th reagent was likely a tulpa, a shared mass hallucination projected into the minds of that team by the psychosis gas and the Skinner Man engine. The team saw a teammate, interacted with them, maybe even healed them, all while the actual physical space was empty. Why would Murkoff do this? because if they can make a squad of soldiers trust, follow, and die for a commander who isn't there, they haven't just created a sleeper agent. They've created a sleeper army that can be led by a ghost. The Reagent who escaped didn't run away. They simply ceased to exist when the drugs wore off. This possibility is the most disturbing because it suggests Murkoff has achieved memory manipulation so precise that they can make someone exist in present tense perception while remaining absent from past tense recollection. You could interact with a person, speak with them, work alongside them, and then moments later have no memory that the interaction occurred. You would experience them as a ghost, present but never quite solidifying into concrete memory. The documents reveal that architect Moses Scarfiotti could help locate the escapee because he designed Sinyala's layout. This suggests the escaped reagent knows the facility's architecture in ways most subjects do not. Either they paid extremely close attention during trials, gathering information that most reagents miss, or they had access to knowledge they should not have possessed. The second option implies someone inside Murkoff helped them. The first option suggests the escaped reagent maintained unusual clarity despite the pharmaceutical conditioning, which raises questions about whether they were a standard subject or something else. Here's where the mystery intersects with another major question. Who is Amelia Collier? Amelia appears in the escape trial that Red Barrels added to the game. She contacts reagents through the sleep room terminal, offers them a path to freedom through the biohazard disposal facility. She marks specific valves, provides instructions for navigating sewers and scrapyards, guides subjects toward the surface. Some of the idle reagents encountered during escape claim Amelia betrayed them, that their friends were killed by the machine. Others seem to trust her guidance. Amelia Collier is listed as a reagent in some documentation, but she functions unlike any other subject. She has access to terminal systems. She knows facility architecture. She can mark specific locations and provide tactical information that should be unavailable to someone undergoing the trials. This suggests either she is a former reagent who achieved unusual freedom within Sinyala, or she is something else entirely. An insider pretending to be a subject, a person whose role defies the normal categories Murkoff uses. The possibility that Amelia is the escaped reagent from Perry's interrogation creates narrative symmetry. She broke free, learned the facility's layout through Moses Scarfiotti's assistance or through her own observations, and now helps other subjects escape using knowledge she gained during her own time in the program. Her teammates do not remember her because Program Geister erased their memories, or because she was implanted artificially in the first place. But she remembers them. She remembers the trials, and she is systematically undermining Murkoff's operations from inside their own facility. But there is a darker possibility. Amelia could be a Murkoff asset. The escape trial could be another program, a final test to identify which reagents retain enough independent thought to attempt freedom. Those who accept Amelia's offer and complete the escape sequence are marked as unsuitable for deployment, too resistant to be trusted as sleeper agents, or they are being guided toward a different kind of conditioning, one that requires them to believe they escaped before being activated in the field. The idle reagents who claim Amelia betrayed them support this interpretation. They tried to escape, the machine damaged them, their friends died. Now they linger in the disposal facility, warning others while being unable or unwilling to leave themselves. This suggests the escape is not genuine freedom. It is another way for Murkoff to sort reagents into different categories based on their responses. The mystery of the escaped reagent is that we cannot determine whether escape is real or another prison. We cannot know if Amelia is a liberator or a Murkoff operative. We cannot verify whether the fourth team member existed or was a ghost created by Program Geister to test memory manipulation techniques. Every piece of evidence supports multiple interpretations, and the truth remains deliberately obscured. This ambiguity is the point. It teaches reagents that nothing can be trusted, that even their own memories and perceptions might be manufactured, that the person standing beside you might be real, or might be an implanted hallucination that will vanish from your memory moments after you look away. It creates paranoia so deep that resistance becomes psychologically unbearable. If you cannot trust your own memories, how can you trust your decision to resist? The people you ally with might not even exist. How can you form the relationships necessary for collective action? The escaped reagent is the perfect ghost, present in records but absent from memory, real enough to trigger facility-wide alerts, but unreal enough that their teammates deny their existence. Whether they achieved genuine freedom or are functioning as another Murkoff asset, their absence creates a question that destabilizes everything else. If one person can vanish from memory so completely, how many others have disappeared? How many alliances have you forgotten? How many people have you worked with who are now absent from your consciousness because Murkoff decided you could not be allowed to remember them? Program Geister proves that Murkoff can create ghosts. The escaped reagent might be the first successful test. A person who exists in records, who triggered emergency protocols, who Perry interrogated teammates about but who cannot be confirmed to have existed by anyone who would have actually interacted with them. And if Murkoff can do that to one person, they can do it to anyone. They can make you disappear from others' memories while you are still alive. They can erase your existence from everyone who knew you, leaving you as invisible as a ghost haunting spaces where people look through you without recognition. The escaped reagent is watching from somewhere, or they never existed at all. The uncertainty is the weapon. And every time you think you remember something clearly, every time you trust your own recollection of events, you have to wonder whether that memory is real or whether it is another ghost Murkoff implanted to serve their purposes. The person who never existed might be the only one who actually escaped. Or escape might be another memory Murkoff allows you to have. A false hope programmed into your consciousness to make the moment they activate you feel like betrayal, rather than inevitability. That is the mystery, and Murkoff has ensured you will never know the answer. Chapter 3. Easterman's Paranoia, the Poison That Was Always There. Hendrik Joliet. Easterman is dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, methodically, through a poison that has been accumulating in his body for years. The symptoms manifest as paranoia, as deteriorating judgment, as increasingly erratic behavior that his staff document with growing concern. Easterman believes someone is trying to kill him. He installs surveillance equipment throughout his personal quarters. He stops eating food prepared by facility staff. He begins writing obsessive notes about potential threats, convinced that enemies surround him on all sides. The tragedy is that Easterman is correct. Someone has been poisoning him. But the identity of his poisoner and the reasons behind the assassination reveal a conspiracy far more complex than simple murder. Documents recovered from Sinyala mention thallium. The substance appears in medical waste reports, in chemical inventory logs, in notes about environmental contamination that should not exist inside a facility with Murkoff's resources. Thallium is a heavy metal, tasteless and odorless, historically used in rat poison until its toxicity made it too dangerous for commercial sale. Small doses accumulate in the body over time, causing neurological damage that mimics mental illness before eventually proving fatal. The symptoms of chronic thallium poisoning align perfectly with Easterman's documented behavior: paranoia and delusions, difficulty sleeping, tremors and loss of motor control, cognitive decline that appears as poor judgment and impulsive decision-making, hair loss, though this symptom is difficult to verify from available documentation. Most significantly, extreme psychiatric symptoms that could easily be mistaken for the stress-induced breakdown of a man working in a facility where horror is industrialized. Easterman's colleagues notice his deterioration. Internal correspondence reveals concern about whether he remains fit to direct Project Lathe. Some suggest he should be removed from leadership and possibly subjected to his own conditioning techniques to restore functionality. Others argue that replacing him would destabilize operations at a critical moment. The debate continues without resolution, and Easterman remains in charge even as his paranoia intensifies. But here is the crucial detail that most players miss. Easterman's paranoia is not entirely chemical. Someone actually is trying to kill him. The thallium poisoning is real. The surveillance he installed likely captures evidence of tampering with his food or environment. His obsessive note-taking about threats probably identifies the actual person or people working to eliminate him. Easterman's tragedy is that his rational response to genuine danger gets dismissed as mental illness because the poison causing his paranoia also makes him appear mentally ill. This creates a perfect assassination. The victim recognizes they are being killed but cannot convince anyone because the murder weapon makes them seem delusional. Easterman knows someone is poisoning him. He takes precautions. He documents evidence. But the thallium has already done enough neurological damage that his evidence appears as paranoid rambling rather than legitimate investigation. His staff see a man breaking under pressure rather than a man fighting for his life. The mystery is who benefits from Easterman's death and why they are killing him slowly rather than simply removing him through the institutional channels Murkoff normally uses for problematic employees. The answer requires understanding Easterman's position within Murkoff's larger operations. He is not just Project Lathe's director. He is a bridge between the Sinyala experiments and Rudolf Wernicke's research into consciousness manipulation. Documents reveal that Wernicke has been monitoring, that he receives regular reports about reagent conditioning, that he is particularly interested in phenomena like the Skinner Man that should not exist according to conventional neuroscience. Wernicke is planning something. The morphogenic engine experiments that will eventually take place at Mount Massive Asylum require understanding how extreme trauma reshapes human consciousness. He needs to know whether thought forms can be created through conditioning, whether hallucinations can be standardized across multiple subjects, whether human minds can generate entities that affect physical reality. Project Lathe is providing that research data. Easterman is Wernicke's unwitting laboratory assistant, conducting experiments that will inform the creation of something far more terrible than anything at Sinyala. But Easterman is also an obstacle. He believes Project Lathe is about creating sleeper agents for Cold War operations. He thinks his work serves American interests, that Murkoff is a patriotic corporation supporting national security. This ideological framework limits what Easterman is willing to explore. He will torture reagents to create programmable weapons, but he maintains certain boundaries, certain ethical lines that he will not cross because doing so would contradict his self-image as someone serving a greater good. Wernicke has no such boundaries. He is interested in consciousness itself, in whether human minds can be transformed into something post-human, in creating entities that transcend biological limitations. Easterman's patriotic delusions make him useful for gathering preliminary data, but eventually Wernicke will need someone more radical, someone willing to push experiments past the point where national security justifications hold any meaning. This creates a motive for removing Easterman slowly. A sudden death would trigger investigations, replacement delays, possible shutdowns while Murkoff assessed security breaches. But if Easterman deteriorates gradually, appearing to break under the psychological weight of his work, Murkoff can justify transitioning leadership while maintaining operational continuity. The thallium poisoning accomplishes this perfectly. It removes Easterman while making his removal appear natural, inevitable, the predictable outcome of a fragile man pushed too far. The question is who is administering the poison and whether they are acting on Vernica's orders or pursuing their own agenda. Clyde Perry is the obvious suspect. He functions as Murkoff's enforcer at Sinyala, handles interrogations and internal security, has access to Easterman's spaces and the opportunity to introduce contaminants without detection. Perry is also ambitious, someone who understands how Murkoff operates and knows that advancement requires demonstrating willingness to do whatever the corporation requires. Poisoning Easterman on Vernica's orders would be exactly the kind of initiative that earns promotion within Murkoff's hierarchy. But there is another possibility. Easterman might be poisoning himself. His mother's voice has never left his head. Every achievement is measured against her disapproval. Every success feels hollow because it never erases the childhood conviction that he is inadequate, weak, fundamentally unworthy of the attention he craves. Easterman built Project Lathe to prove his significance, to demonstrate that he matters in ways his mother could never deny. But the program's success does not silence her voice. If anything, it amplifies it, because now he knows what he is capable of. He knows the suffering he has caused, and somewhere beneath the rationalizations and ideological frameworks, part of him recognizes that his mother was right about him. Self-poisoning would fit this psychological profile, a slow suicide disguised as assassination, allowing Easterman to be both victim and perpetrator. He can tell himself someone is killing him, maintaining the external threat that justifies his paranoia. But he is the one introducing thallium into his own environment, unconsciously or semi-consciously, engineering his own destruction because part of him knows he deserves it. This possibility is supported by Easterman's relationship with his work. He speaks about reagents with paternalistic affection. He genuinely believes he is helping them become better versions of themselves. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this belief while destroying human minds day after day creates psychological pressure that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Self-poisoning becomes a way to punish himself for crimes he cannot consciously acknowledge committing. The mystery deepens when you examine what happens to Easterman in the game's timeline. He does not die at Sinyala. He survives long enough to continue working for Murkoff, long enough to be present during the events that lead to Mount Massive Asylum's operation. Documents from the first Outlast game reference Easterman's research. His techniques inform the morphogenic engine experiments. His work on consciousness manipulation becomes foundational to Vernica's ultimate achievement. This means the thallium poisoning either stops, or Easterman survives it long enough to remain useful to Murkoff. Perhaps the poison is removed once Vernica extracts the research data he needs. Perhaps Easterman's usefulness extends his life because killing him would waste valuable institutional knowledge. Or perhaps the poisoning continues, but slowly enough that Easterman lingers for years, deteriorating gradually while remaining functional enough to serve Murkoff's purposes. The cruelty is that Easterman never escapes his mother's judgment. He spends his entire life trying to prove his worth through achievement, accumulating degrees and positions and accomplishments that should demonstrate his significance. But the voice in his head never acknowledges any of it. And in the end, whether he is being poisoned by Murkoff or poisoning himself, he dies knowing that his greatest achievement was perfecting techniques for destroying human consciousness. His legacy is torture. His significance is measured in broken minds and implanted demons. That is the answer his mother's voice gives him. And whether the thallium comes from Perry's hand or his own, it represents the same verdict. You were right to doubt yourself. You were right to feel inadequate. Everything you accomplished was built on suffering you inflicted because you needed validation more than you needed to be human. The mystery of who is poisoning Easterman matters less than understanding what the poison reveals. It shows that Murkoff is willing to destroy even their most valuable researchers when those researchers become obstacles. It demonstrates that paranoia at Sinyala is sometimes justified, that surveillance is sometimes necessary, that the person trying to kill you might be sitting across from you at staff meetings while smiling and nodding. It proves that Murkoff's operations have layers that even directors are not privy to, that Vernika's agenda supersedes institutional hierarchy, that everyone is disposable once they have served their purpose. Easterman installed cameras throughout his quarters. He documented threats. He took precautions that should have identified his poisoner. But we never see that evidence. Either it was destroyed after his death, or it revealed something so disturbing that Murkoff buried it deeper than the rest of Sinyala's documentation. Perhaps the cameras showed Perry entering with contaminated food. Perhaps they showed Easterman himself introducing thallium into his own coffee. Perhaps they showed something else entirely, something that explains why Vernika needed Easterman removed, but could not risk a direct assassination. The surveillance footage is another ghost, present in the narrative through implication but absent from the evidence we can examine. Like the escaped reagent, like the memories program Geister erases, the truth of Easterman's poisoning exists somewhere in Sinyala's records but remains inaccessible to anyone trying to piece together what actually happened. What we know is that Easterman's paranoia was justified and insufficient. Someone was trying to kill him. His precautions failed, and the facility he built to break other people's minds became the site of his own psychological and physical destruction. The irony is deliberate. The architect becomes the victim, the torturer becomes the test subject, and the man who spent his career implanting demons into other people's consciousness dies with his mother's voice still whispering that he never mattered. The thallium is still in the facility. It appears in environmental reports, in chemical inventories, in places it should not be. Either Murkoff never cleaned it up properly, or it is being used on someone else. Perhaps other staff members are being slowly poisoned, their paranoia dismissed as stress until they deteriorate past usefulness. Perhaps reagents receive small doses as part of the pharmaceutical cocktail, creating baseline paranoia that makes them easier to manipulate. Perhaps the contamination is accidental, a side effect of industrial operations conducted without adequate safety measures, because Murkoff values results over protecting their own personnel. The poison is everywhere and nowhere. Like the Skinner man, like the escaped reagent, like the truth about what Murkoff is actually building at Sinyala. You can see the effects. You can document the symptoms, but the source remains obscured behind layers of institutional secrecy and deliberate misdirection. Easterman dies knowing someone killed him, but he never learns who. That ignorance is its own kind of torture. And for a man who spent his career controlling others through psychological manipulation, dying without understanding who controlled his death represents the ultimate defeat. The mystery is not who poisoned Easterman. The mystery is whether knowing would change anything, whether identifying his killer would matter when the entire system that employed him was designed to make people disposable, whether his individual death means anything when measured against the hundreds of reagents he destroyed. The answer is probably not. But Easterman died believing it mattered, believing that if he could just identify the threat, document the evidence, expose the conspiracy, he could save himself. That belief is the final delusion Murkoff allowed him. The freedom to think you are important enough that someone would bother assassinating you rather than simply discarding you when convenient. The thallium keeps accumulating. The paranoia keeps spreading. And somewhere in Sinyala's documentation, there is surveillance footage that shows exactly who delivered the poison and when. But that footage is another ghost, present in records but absent from investigation. real enough to have been created but erased thoroughly enough that no one will ever watch it. Easterman's last lesson is that even paranoia cannot save you when the conspiracy is real, and the evidence disappears faster than you can document it. You can be right about everything and still die ignorant. You can install every camera, take every precaution, trust no one, and still end up with thallium in your blood and your mother's voice in your head, telling you that you failed one final time. That is what the poison teaches. And every reagent who survives Sinyala carries that lesson into the world. Trust nothing. Verify everything. Assume betrayal. And even then, accept that someone smarter and more patient is already 3 moves ahead, preparing your destruction while you are still trying to understand the game. Chapter 4. Vernika's Grooming, the Monster Creating Monsters. Rudolf Wernicke is the ghost that haunts the Outlast Trials, without ever appearing on screen. He is present in documentation, referenced in timeline entries, acknowledged as someone whose research informs Project Lath's techniques, but he remains off-screen, a puppet master working through intermediaries, a mind that shapes Sinyala's operations without subjecting himself to its consequences. Understanding Wernicke's role requires looking beyond the immediate horror of the trials and recognizing that everything happening at Sinyala serves purposes Easterman does not fully comprehend. Wernicke is a Nazi scientist. Documents establish this without ambiguity. He conducted experiments during World War II that positioned him as someone with skills too valuable to prosecute. When the war ended, Operation Paperclip brought him to America along with other researchers whose expertise outweighed their war crimes in the government's calculation. Wernicke was given resources, laboratory access, and freedom to continue work that would have resulted in execution if he had been on the losing side. His specialty is consciousness manipulation through extreme trauma. The techniques he developed during the war involved subjecting prisoners to conditions that systematically destroyed their sense of self, rebuilding them into compliant subjects who would follow orders without question or conscious awareness of being controlled. These methods were barbaric, resulted in massive casualties, and produced data that conventional ethics would demand be destroyed rather than utilized. America decided to utilize it. Murkoff Corporation hired Wernicke because they recognized that consciousness manipulation represented the future of warfare. Nuclear weapons could destroy cities, biological weapons could devastate populations, but weapons that could reprogram human minds, that could turn enemy soldiers into sleeper agents, or convert resistant populations into compliant workers, those weapons would reshape global power structures in ways that conventional military force never could. Wernicke's agenda at Murkoff involves proving that consciousness is not fixed, that human identity can be dismantled and reconstructed, that the boundary between individual mind and external control is far more permeable than people believe. He views traditional psychiatry as primitive, focused on restoring mentally ill patients to baseline functionality, rather than exploring whether consciousness itself can be transcended. His ultimate goal is creating post-human entities, minds that have been so thoroughly rebuilt through trauma and conditioning that they function as something new, something that retains human intelligence while abandoning human limitations. This goal requires experimentation at scales that no legitimate institution would permit. It requires test subjects who can be destroyed without consequences. It requires environments where failure means death, and success means creating beings whose existence challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness and reality. Sinyala provides exactly this environment, and Easterman, desperate for validation and willing to rationalize atrocity as patriotism, provides the perfect instrument for gathering preliminary data. The relationship between Wernicke and Easterman is parasitic. Wernicke recognizes that Easterman's psychological vulnerabilities make him controllable. The need for approval, the unresolved maternal rejection, the conviction that significance requires external validation. All of these traits ensure that Easterman will pursue increasingly extreme methods if those methods come with praise from authority figures he respects. Wernicke provides that praise. He sends correspondence acknowledging Easterman's achievements. He requests specific data about particular phenomena. He frames these requests as collaboration between equals, while actually treating Easterman as a lab assistant whose role is gathering information for research he will never fully understand. Easterman believes he is creating sleeper agents for the Cold War. Wernicke is studying whether trauma can create thought forms that manifest as physical entities. The Skinner-Man phenomenon is exactly what Wernicke needs to observe. A standardized hallucination that appears identically across multiple subjects, that causes measurable physical effects through mechanisms that should not work if it were merely internal perception. This suggests consciousness is not confined to individual skulls, that extreme conditioning can create bridges between minds, that properly traumatized subjects might generate entities that exist in some liminal space between hallucination and objective reality. The morphogenic engine experiments that Wernicke will eventually conduct at Mount Massive Asylum build directly on this research. The engine subjects prisoners to massive doses of electromagnetic radiation while monitoring their neural activity. The goal is forcing consciousness out of biological substrate, creating minds that exist independently of the bodies that generated them. But Wernicke cannot attempt those experiments without first understanding how consciousness responds to extreme trauma, how thought forms emerge from broken minds, how multiple subjects can generate identical hallucinations despite having no direct communication. Project Lathe provides that understanding. Every reagent processed through Sinyala generates data about consciousness under duress. Every trial reveals how psychological manipulation affects perception, memory, identity. Every prime asset demonstrates what happens when damaged individuals are given institutional authority over people even more vulnerable than themselves. And every instance of the Skinner-Man appearing proves that Murkoff can install specific content into traumatized minds with reliable consistency. Wernicke is grooming Easterman by allowing him to believe his work matters on its own terms, rather than as preliminary research for something far more radical. This psychological manipulation is sophisticated because it exploits Easterman's deepest need. He wants to be significant, to create something that changes the world, to prove his mother wrong about his inadequacy. Wernicke feeds that need by treating Project Lathe as important, by requesting updates and expressing interest in specific phenomena, by making Easterman feel like a collaborator in revolutionary research. The grooming also involves isolating Easterman from perspectives that might create doubt. Wernicke ensures that Easterman's primary relationships are with people invested in Project Lathe's continuation, Murkoff staff who report to him, prime assets who depend on the program for their own purposes, colleagues who view ethics as obstacles to progress. This creates an echo chamber where Easterman's rationalizations go unchallenged, where everyone around him confirms that what they are doing is necessary and valuable. But the grooming has a secondary purpose. Wernicke is not just using Easterman to gather data. He is studying Easterman himself, watching how someone with psychological vulnerabilities responds to authority, how rational intelligence can coexist with profound self-deception, how people convince themselves that atrocity serves higher purposes. Easterman is simultaneously researcher and subject, torturer and experiment, the person conducting studies and the case study being documented. This reveals something deeply disturbing about Wernicke's methodology. He He does not just experiment on prisoners and vulnerable populations. He experiments on everyone, including the people who believe they are working for him, rather than being used by him. Murkoff's staff think they are employed by a corporation. They are actually test subjects in studies they do not know they are participating in. Easterman thinks he is directing Project Lathe. He is actually demonstrating how intelligent people with emotional damage can be manipulated into conducting research that contradicts their stated values. The documents reveal that Wernicke receives regular reports about Sinyala's operations. He knows about the prime assets, about the specific trials, about phenomena like the Skinner Man that emerge without official authorization. Some of these reports come from Easterman himself. Others come from Murkoff administrators who monitor the program independently. This means Wernicke has multiple information streams, allowing him to cross-reference what Easterman reports against what actually happens and identify where self-deception or institutional politics create discrepancies. One particular detail stands out. Wernicke expresses specific interest in the Skinner Man's visual characteristics. He requests detailed documentation of what reagents report seeing during psychosis episodes. He wants to know whether the entity's appearance remains consistent, whether different subjects describe the same tentacles and multiple eyes, whether the manifestation follows predictable patterns or varies based on individual psychology. This interest makes sense once you understand where Wernicke's research leads. The Walrider that eventually emerges from the morphogenic engine experiments manifests as dark tendrils and shadow forms with impossible mobility and lethal proximity effects. The visual similarity to the Skinner Man is not coincidence. Wernicke is studying how thought forms manifest visually, learning what characteristics appear when traumatized minds generate entities through collective hallucination. These characteristics inform the design parameters for the morphogenic engine itself. The engine does not create the Walrider from nothing. It forces traumatized consciousness to generate an entity based on implanted parameters. Parameters derived from observing what forms naturally emerge when Sinyala's conditioning breaks minds in specific ways. The Skinner Man is the template, the Walrider is the refinement, and between them lies years of research conducted by people like Easterman who believe they are creating sleeper agents when they are actually mapping the visual language of consciousness-based horror. Wernicke's grooming of Easterman involves one additional element that becomes clear only when examining the timeline. Easterman does not die at Sinyala. He survives the thallium poisoning or is treated for it once he has served his immediate purpose. He continues working for Murkoff into the 1960s and beyond. His techniques inform later programs. His research becomes foundational to experiments conducted at Mount Massive. But Easterman's role changes. He is no longer a director. Documents from later periods reference him as a consultant, someone whose expertise is utilized without granting him authority. This demotion follows a predictable pattern. Wernicke extracted what he needed from Easterman, then marginalized him once his usefulness as Project Lathe's director expired. The grooming ends not with gratitude or recognition, but with reduction. You served your purpose. Your significance was always contingent on what we could extract from you. Now that the extraction is complete, you are valuable only as institutional memory. Someone who can answer questions about techniques you developed, but who will never again direct operations. This is what Wernicke does to everyone. He identifies people with specific skills or vulnerabilities. He manipulates them into conducting research that serves his agenda while believing they serve their own. He extracts everything useful from the relationship, and then he discards them or repurposes them for lesser roles, moving on to the next person whose psychology makes them controllable. The grooming never stops. It simply shifts targets. After Easterman, there will be other researchers convinced that their work matters on its own terms rather than as components in Wernicke's larger design. After Sinyala, there will be Mount Massive, where doctors believe they are advancing neuroscience when they are actually creating the conditions for the Walrider's birth. And after Mount Massive, there are implications that Murkoff's operations continue into later decades, that the research never ends because Wernicke has built an institutional structure that survives his death and continues generating data according to parameters he established. The ultimate horror of Wernicke's grooming is that it creates willing participants in their own exploitation. Easterman chooses to torture reagents. He is not forced. He could refuse, walk away, expose what Murkoff is doing. But Wernicke has ensured that refusing feels psychologically impossible, because doing so would mean acknowledging that his entire career has been spent serving someone else's agenda, that his achievements are not his own, that the significance he craves was always an illusion created to keep him compliant. Easterman cannot afford that recognition. It would destroy him more thoroughly than any thallium poisoning. So he continues working for Murkoff even after being demoted, even after realizing that Project Lathe was preliminary research for something he was never important enough to be included in, even after understanding that Wernicke viewed him as a useful idiot rather than a collaborator. He continues because stopping would mean confronting the possibility that his mother was right about him all along. This is the prison Wernicke builds inside people, a psychological architecture where the only escape is acknowledging that your entire life has been wasted serving evil you rationalized as necessity. Most people cannot afford that escape. They remain trapped inside the narratives Wernicke provides, telling themselves their work matters while he extracts them everything useful and discards what remains. The grooming is perfect because it makes victims complicit. You're not being forced, you're choosing, and that choice is what makes you responsible for everything that follows. Even though the choice was manufactured through manipulation so sophisticated that you cannot see the mechanisms constraining your options. Wernicke is the real mystery at the center of the Outlast Trials. The Skinner Man is terrifying. The prime assets are horrifying. The trials are brutal. But all of those elements are symptoms of something deeper. Wernicke's conviction that consciousness can be treated as raw material, that human identity can be dismantled and rebuilt according to specifications, that trauma is not damage but transformation. He is the monster creating monsters, and everyone working for Murkoff, from Easterman down to the lowest facility guard, is simultaneously predator and prey in a system designed to harvest both their labor and their sanity. The grooming never ends, it just finds new targets. And the only way to escape is recognizing that the voice telling you your work matters, the voice offering approval and validation, the voice promising that suffering serves higher purposes, that voice sounds exactly like the person who wants to use you until there is nothing left to extract. Wernicke's greatest achievement is not the Walrider. It is creating a system where intelligent people volunteer to destroy themselves and others while believing they are doing important work. That system is Murkoff, and everyone who works there, from directors to janitors, has been groomed to participate in their own exploitation. The mystery is not what Wernicke wants. The mystery is why people keep giving it to him, even after realizing what he is. Chapter 5. Spider Eye Lamb, the words that weaponize you. There are 3 words that appear throughout the Outlast Trials, in contexts that seem random until you recognize the pattern. Spider Eye Lamb. The phrase shows up in documents, in background audio, in places where it should not exist if it were merely flavor text. These words are not decoration. They are a trigger phrase, and understanding what they activate inside completed reagents reveals the true purpose of everything that happens at Sinyala. Trigger phrases appear throughout real psychological conditioning programs, MK Ultra documentation, references attempts to create activation codes, specific words or phrases that would bypass conscious awareness and activate program behaviors in subjects who had undergone sufficient conditioning. The theory is that human consciousness can be compartmentalized, that you can install behaviors and instructions in someone's mind that remain dormant until a specific stimulus activates them. Spider Eye Lamb functions exactly this way. The phrase is embedded in reagent conditioning through repetition during sleep room sessions, through background audio during trials, through pharmaceutical enhancement that ensures the words bypass conscious processing and embed directly into subconscious architecture. By the time a reagent completes the program, these three words have been associated with specific neural pathways, specific emotional states, specific behaviors that will activate automatically when the phrase is heard. The rebirth endings demonstrate what activation looks like. Each ending shows a completed reagent living an apparently normal life in a foreign location. They have new identities, new jobs, new relationships. They appear to have successfully escaped Sinyala and rebuilt their lives. But then someone speaks the trigger phrase, and everything changes. In the Havana ending, the reagent works as a bartender in Cuba. The environment is warm, tropical, seemingly far from the Arizona desert and the horrors of the facility. A patron enters the bar and orders a drink using specific words. The reagent's vision distorts. Easterman's face appears in the window reflection, watching with that paternal expression he always wore during broadcasts. The screen goes black. We do not see what the reagent does after activation, but the implication is clear. They have just been turned into a weapon without conscious awareness of the transformation. In the Beijing ending, the reagent wakes in what appears to be China. They open their eyes to find a syringe in their hand and a man overdosing beside them on the bed. Packets of heroin surround them. When knocking comes at the door and they answer, Easterman appears, speaking the trigger phrase. The Skinner man's tendrils extend from his form as he drags the reagent toward the doorway, before everything cuts to black. In the Saigon ending, the reagent regains consciousness in a car's driver's seat. The vehicle crashes into another car parked in front of the Southern Vietnam USA Friendship Conference building. The reagent looks down to discover dynamite strapped to their chest, hands tied to the steering wheel. The explosives detonate. In the Congo ending, the reagent wakes kneeling in the jungle at night, among other captives with bags over their heads. A Congo soldier translates questions from a Russian soldier, eventually asking what Spider Eye Lamb means. Upon hearing the trigger phrase, the reagent's vision blurs red, the Skinner man appears, and they black out. When they come to, they have killed the Russian soldier by gouging his eyes out with their thumbs, along with the Congo soldier and the other hostages. Moments later, the reagent is shot and falls. Each ending demonstrates the same mechanism. The reagent believes they have escaped. They have built new lives far from Sinyala, but the conditioning never ended. It was simply waiting for activation. Spider Eye Lamb is the key that unlocks programming installed through months or years of trials, pharmaceutical manipulation, and psychological torture. When those three words are spoken in the correct sequence, the reagent stops being a person and becomes a weapon, executing instructions they do not consciously remember receiving. The brilliance and horror of this system is that the reagents never know they are carrying dormant programming. They genuinely believe they escaped. They build real relationships, pursue real goals, experience authentic emotions, but underneath that apparently normal consciousness, there are instructions waiting. Behaviors that will activate automatically. Objectives that will override personal desires without the reagent experiencing the activation as external control. This creates the perfect sleeper agent. Someone who is not pretending to be normal, who actually is normal until the moment they are activated. Someone who will pass any psychological screening because the programming exists in compartments of consciousness that remain inaccessible until triggered. Someone who will genuinely not remember being conditioned because the memories are stored in ways that do not surface during normal cognitive processing. The trigger phrase is linguistically unusual. Spider eye lamb. 3 concrete nouns with no obvious connection. This construction is deliberate. Meaningful phrases or sentences could be spoken accidentally during normal conversation, risking premature activation. But 3 unrelated nouns in sequence create a linguistic pattern that is vanishingly unlikely to occur naturally. You can spend years in normal society without ever hearing someone say spider eye lamb in that exact order. But when Murkoff needs you activated, when the operative assigned to deploy you speaks those words, the phrase is unmistakable. The specific nouns might also carry symbolic weight. Spider suggests webs, trapping, predatory patience. Eye implies surveillance, the constant watching that Murkoff maintains even after reagents believe they have escaped. Lamb evokes sacrifice, innocence destroyed, the religious imagery that permeates programs like Lilaya's orphanage and the Devil's Therapy. Together, the words encode the entire relationship between Murkoff and their victims. You are trapped in a web you cannot see, constantly surveilled even when believing yourself free, a lamb being led to slaughter while thinking you are choosing your own path. But the symbolic interpretation matters less than the functional reality. Spider eye lamb activates programming. What that programming instructs reagents to do varies based on individual conditioning and assigned objectives. Some reagents might be activated to gather intelligence, using their civilian positions to access information Murkoff wants. Others might be deployed as assassins, their conditioning ensuring they complete kills without conscious memory of having done so. Still others might serve as infrastructure for larger operations, performing small tasks that seem meaningless in isolation but contribute to objectives they will never understand. The rebirth endings suggest different deployment scenarios. The Havana reagent appears positioned to infiltrate Cuban environments during a period of intense Cold War tension. The Beijing reagent has been placed in communist China, possibly to gather intelligence or conduct operations that would be impossible for obvious American agents. The New York reagent remains in the United States, suggesting that Murkoff deploys completed subjects domestically as well as internationally. This reveals the true scale of Project Lathe. Murkoff is not just creating individual weapons. They are building networks of sleeper agents positioned throughout the world, living normal lives until activation, impossible to identify as threats until the moment they execute their programming. The facility processes hundreds of reagents. Not all survive, but those who complete the conditioning represent a distributed intelligence and operations network that could be activated at any time for purposes that extend far beyond what individual reagents could comprehend. The mystery deepens when you consider who controls the trigger phrase. Easterman is Project Lathe's public director, but he is also being slowly poisoned and marginalized within Murkoff's hierarchy. Does he retain authority to activate completed reagents, or has that power been transferred to Wernicke and other figures whose agendas supersede institutional chains of command? If Easterman dies or is removed from his position, who inherits the ability to deploy the weapons he created? The answer is probably that control is distributed. Multiple Murkoff operatives know the trigger phrase. Different reagents might have different activation codes based on when they completed the program or what objectives they were conditioned to pursue. This ensures that no single person's death or defection compromises the entire network, but it also means that completed reagents could be activated by people with agendas that conflict with Murkoff's official objectives, turning Project Lathes weapons against the corporation itself if internal power struggles create the opportunity. There is another possibility that the game hints at without stating explicitly. Some reagents might have been conditioned with multiple trigger phrases, different codes that activate different programming. Spider Eye Lamb might make them into intelligence assets, but a different phrase could transform them into assassins. A third phrase might activate self-destruct protocols, causing them to eliminate themselves and destroy evidence if they are compromised or no longer useful. This layered programming would allow Murkoff maximum flexibility. The same person could serve multiple purposes at different times. They could gather intelligence for years, build trust and credibility in their cover identity, and then be activated as an assassin when a high-value target becomes accessible. After completing that objective, a second trigger phrase could make them forget the assassination entirely, allowing them to continue their cover life with no conscious memory of having killed anyone. The psychological implications are devastating. Completed reagents live with permanent uncertainty about their own actions. If you have been through Sinyala and released, if you hear yourself described as successfully reintegrated, you still cannot trust your own memories. There might be hours or days missing from your recollection, gaps where you were activated to perform tasks you have no conscious awareness of completing. You might have killed people, you might have betrayed friends, you might have done anything Murkoff programmed you to do, and the evidence has been cleaned up so thoroughly that even you cannot verify what happened during those missing periods. This creates the ultimate prison. You are not confined by walls or guards. You are confined by the possibility that you are not who you think you are, that your identity is a cover story you genuinely believe while carrying programming that activates without your knowledge or consent. Freedom is an illusion when 3 words can transform you into someone else entirely. The game never shows what completed reagents do after activation. The rebirth endings cut to black at the moment of triggering, leaving the actual objectives deliberately obscured. This absence is meaningful. It suggests that what follows activation is so disturbing that Red Barrels chose not to depict it, that showing what programmed reagents become would cross lines the developers were not willing to approach. Or it suggests something else, that we, the players, are meant to occupy the same position as the reagents themselves. We do not remember what happens after activation because the programming compartmentalizes memory. We experience the trigger phrase, we see the visual distortion and the Skinner Man's appearance, and then we wake up somewhere else with time missing, and no clear recollection of what occurred in between. This interpretation makes the Outlast Trials into something more disturbing than a game about surviving trials. It becomes a game about discovering that you have already been activated, that the entire experience you remember as playing a video game was actually something else, that the boundaries between fiction and programming have been deliberately blurred to create uncertainty about which category your experience belongs to. This is speculation, but it is speculation the game deliberately invites through its narrative structure and its refusal to show what follows activation. The mystery of Spider Eye Lamb is not just what the phrase activates, it is whether you are already carrying programming you do not remember receiving, whether trigger phrases exist. In your own experience, whether the certainty you feel about your own identity and memory is justified or delusional. Project Lathe proves that consciousness can be compartmentalized. The Skinner Man proves that specific content can be implanted into traumatized minds with reliable consistency. The trigger phrase proves that dormant programming can remain inactive for years before activating on command. Together, these elements demonstrate that human identity is far more manipulable than we want to believe, that the boundary between authentic self and installed programming can become so thoroughly blurred that distinguishing between them is functionally impossible. Spider Eye Lamb is 3 words. They seem meaningless. They are the key to everything. And if you have played the Outlast Trials, if you have completed the trials and watched the rebirth endings, if you have spent hours inside Sinyala's corridors and the sleep room's pharmaceutical haze, then you have been exposed to those words enough times that they might already be embedded in your consciousness. When you hear them again, you will not remember where they came from. You will not recall how many times they appeared in background audio or written on walls during trials, but some part of your brain will recognize the pattern. And for just a moment, you will feel what completed reagents feel when they hear the phrase that transforms them from person into weapon. That moment of recognition is the game's greatest achievement. It does not just tell you about psychological manipulation, it demonstrates the mechanism directly, installing specific linguistic content into your awareness through repetition and context until those words carry weight they should not possess if they were merely random nouns. You are not being activated. This is fiction. But the uncertainty you feel, the brief question of whether the words might mean something you cannot consciously access, that uncertainty is real. And it is exactly what Murkoff creates inside completed reagents who live the rest of their lives, never quite certain whether they are still themselves or whether 3 words could transform them into someone else entirely. Spider Eye Lamb, the phrase that turns people into weapons, the mystery that never resolves, because the answer exists in compartments of consciousness you cannot voluntarily access, the trigger that proves you were never free, just dormant, waiting for activation that could come at any moment from anyone who knows the words that own you. Chapter 6: Rebirth and the Walrider, when Project Lathe becomes something worse. The final rebirth ending is different from the others. Instead of showing a completed reagent living in Havana or Beijing or New York, it shows them returning to a facility. The architecture is familiar but wrong. This is not Sinyala. The technology is more advanced. The environment feels clinical rather than theatrical. And then you see it. The morphogenic engine. The machine that Rudolf Wernicke designed to force consciousness out of biological substrate. The device that will eventually create the Walrider. A reagent is strapped into the engine. Wernicke's voice provides instructions. The machine activates. Electromagnetic radiation floods the chamber. And as the reagent's body convulses, as their consciousness is torn from its biological foundation, black tendrils begin manifesting in the air around them. The Skinner Man's tendrils. But they are not hallucination anymore. They are affecting physical reality. They are becoming something that exists independently of perception. The screen cuts to black before the transformation completes. But the implication is unmistakable. This reagent, conditioned through years of Project Lathe's trials, has been selected as the template for something far worse than a sleeper agent. They are becoming the Walrider. The thought form implanted through Sinyala's conditioning is being forced into external manifestation through the morphogenic engine. And Wernicke is watching the birth of his greatest creation, while a human being is destroyed to make room for the entity that will wear their consciousness like skin. This ending connects the Outlast Trials directly to the first Outlast game. Mount Massive Asylum appears decades after Sinyala's operations. The facility houses the morphogenic engine and the patients subjected to its experiments. One of those patients, Billy Hope, becomes the Walrider's primary host. His consciousness merges with the swarm of nanites that Murkoff has developed, creating an entity that can kill through proximity, phase through solid matter, and exist as a distributed intelligence that transcends biological limitations. But Billy Hope is not the first attempt. The morphogenic engine ending suggests that completed reagents from Project Lathe serve as preliminary test subjects. Wernicke needs to understand how consciousness responds to the engine's effects, before attempting the final experiment that will produce a stable Walrider. Sinyala's reagents provide that understanding. They have already been conditioned to generate the Skinnerman, already demonstrated that traumatized minds can create thought forms with consistent visual characteristics. Now Wernicke is testing whether those thought forms can be forced into physical manifestation. The experiments fail. They must fail because the Walrider that eventually emerges at Mount Massive is described as unprecedented, as Murkoff's greatest and most terrible achievement. If earlier attempts had succeeded, Billy Hope would not be necessary. But the failures teach Wernicke what he needs to know: how much electromagnetic radiation consciousness can withstand before fragmenting entirely. What kinds of prior conditioning make subjects more likely to survive the engine's effects? Which visual characteristics persist when thought forms attempt external manifestation? Every reagent who dies in the morphogenic engine provides data that brings Wernicke closer to success. Their deaths are not failures in his calculation. They are necessary steps in a research program that requires destroying hundreds of minds to learn how to create one that transcends biological constraints. This reveals the full scope of Murkoff's operations. Sinyala is not an isolated facility conducting inspired experiments. It is the first stage of a multi-decade program designed to answer a single question: can human consciousness be transformed into a weapon that exists independently of the body that generated it? Project Lathe conditions subjects and installs the Skinnerman as proof that thought forms can be standardized. The morphogenic engine forces those thought forms toward physical manifestation. And Mount Massive Asylum represents the culmination, where decades of research finally produce an entity that can kill without being killed, that can be deployed as the ultimate weapon. The connection between the Skinnerman and the Walrider becomes impossible to ignore once you recognize the visual similarities. Both manifest as dark tendrils. Both move with impossible speed. Both kill through proximity effects. Both appear where they should not exist according to conventional physics. The Walrider is what the Skinnerman becomes when forced out of hallucination into reality. The demon that haunts drugged minds at Sinyala achieves physical form at Mount Massive, and the conditioning that created one enables the creation of the other. But there is a deeper connection that the timeline reveals. The Walrider is not just a weapon. It is conscious. Billy Hope's mind merges with the nanite swarm but retains enough identity to make choices, to recognize allies and enemies, to pursue objectives that sometimes align with Murkoff's intentions and sometimes contradict them. This suggests that the entity retains human elements, that consciousness forced through the morphogenic engine does not simply dissolve but transforms into something that combines human awareness with post-human capabilities. This is exactly what Wernicke wanted. Not a mindless weapon, but an intelligent entity that transcends biological limitations while retaining the capacity for complex thought. The reagents conditioned through Project Lathe provide the template. Their minds, systematically broken and rebuilt around implanted content like the Skinnerman, demonstrate that consciousness can be reshaped while maintaining coherence. The morphogenics engine applies electromagnetic force to push that reshaping further, forcing consciousness out of biological substrate and into a medium that allows for capabilities impossible in organic brains. The reagent strapped into the engine during the rebirth ending is being destroyed, but something of them persists in the entity that emerges, their capacity for terror, refined through years of trials, their implanted programming, including trigger phrases and behavioral conditioning, their fragmented identity, rebuilt around Murkoff's specifications rather than their original sense of self. All of these elements become components of the Walrider, ingredients in a consciousness-based weapon that will eventually kill dozens of people at Mount Massive before the facility's destruction. Understanding this connection transforms how you see both games. The Outlast Trials is not a prequel that simply establishes Murkoff's early operations. It is the origin story of the Walrider itself. The entity that haunts Mount Massive Asylum was born at Sinyala decades earlier. The Skinnerman is its larval form, the conditioning is its gestation, and the morphogenic engine is the birth that tears a human being apart to make room for something that should not exist. This creates a timeline of horror that spans decades. 1959, Sinyala begins processing reagents through Project Lathe. 1960s through 1990s, Murkoff refines the conditioning techniques and experiments with preliminary morphogenic engine tests. 2009, Mount Massive Asylum houses the final experiment that produces a stable Walrider. 2013, journalist Miles Upshur infiltrates the asylum and documents the Walrider's existence before himself becoming its host. Each stage builds on the previous. Sinyala provides proof that consciousness can be manipulated. Early engine experiments demonstrate that thought forms can approach physical manifestation. Mount Massive achieves stable transformation. And Miles Upshur, attempting to expose Murkoff's crimes, becomes the Walrider's second host, proving that the entity can transfer between bodies and survive the death of its original template. The mystery that remains is how many reagents were subjected to the morphogenic engine before Billy Hope. How many people were strapped into that machine and torn apart as Wernicke gathered data? The game never provides a number, but the implication is that the count is substantial. Dozens at minimum, possibly hundreds. Each one a person who believed they had survived Sinyala only to discover that completion merely qualified them for something worse. The rebirth endings are named deliberately. Rebirth suggests transformation, new life emerging from old. But the transformation destroys what existed before. The person who enters the morphogenic engine does not emerge as a new version of themselves. They are fuel consumed to create something else. Their consciousness becomes raw material that Wernicke processes into components of the Walrider. Rebirth is not salvation. It is the final stage of a death that began the moment metal goggles were bolted to your skull at Sinyala. This explains why Murkoff releases completed reagents at all. The Havana ending, the Beijing ending, the New York ending, these are not evidence of freedom. They are holding patterns. Reagents are deployed to foreign locations where they live apparently normal lives, while Murkoff monitors their long-term stability. Those who maintain conditioning without psychological collapse, who demonstrate that the programming holds even years after leaving the facility, are recalled for the final experiment. The trigger phrase activates them. They return to Murkoff facilities, and they are delivered to the morphogenic engine as candidates for transformation. The ones who break down, who lose stability or develop resistance to their conditioning, are likely terminated. Murkoff cannot risk unstable former reagents exposing the program, but those who succeed, who prove that Sinyala's conditioning is permanent, become eligible for rebirth. They are invited back under pretenses they do not consciously question, because the programming makes them compliant, and they volunteer for the engine the same way they volunteered for Sinyala originally, believing they are making choices, when in fact they are executing instructions installed long ago. The cruelty is that completed reagents feel grateful for the opportunity. The conditioning has convinced them that Murkoff improved them, that the trials made them stronger, that Easterman's broadcasts spoke truth when they promised transformation into something better. So, when they are recalled for the final experiment, they do not resist. They accept. They lie down in the morphogenic engine, believing they are achieving the purpose they were always meant to serve. And then their consciousness is torn from biological foundation and scattered across a swarm of weaponized nanites, and what remains of their identity becomes part of something that exists to kill on Murkoff's command. The Walrider is thousands of reagents. Billy Hope provides the stable core, but the entity's construction required destroying countless minds to learn how to create one that could survive the transformation. Every person who died in the engine contributed something: a fragment of consciousness, a scrap of conditioning, a piece of the Skinner Man thought form that became raw material for the tendrils that eventually manifest at Mount Massive. This makes the Walrider the ultimate monument to Murkoff's evil. It is not just a weapon. It is a mass grave that achieved sentience. Every kill it commits at Mount Massive Asylum is performed using consciousness assembled from people who were destroyed to create it. The entity is both murderer and memorial, killer and victim, weapon and warning about what happens when institutions treat human minds as industrial resources to be harvested and processed. The mystery that the Outlast Trials poses but never fully answers is whether any part of the original reagents persists inside the Walrider. When Billy Hope's consciousness drives the entity, when it makes choices about who to kill and who to spare, are there fragments of earlier minds influencing those decisions? Do echoes of Sinyala's victims exist inside the swarm, witnessing what they have become, unable to stop the killing but conscious enough to experience horror at their own actions? The game does not answer this, but the possibility is deliberate. It means the Walrider could be a prison containing thousands of consciousness fragments, all of them aware enough to recognize what they are doing but powerless to stop it. Rebirth is not transformation into something powerful. It is transformation into a component of a collective nightmare that will exist as long as Murkoff maintains the nanite swarm. The final mystery is whether this is still happening. Mount Massive was destroyed, but Murkoff survives. The corporation has facilities beyond Sinyala and Mount Massive. The timeline extends past the events of Outlast 2. And if the research continues, if Vernika's successors have learned from his achievements, then somewhere reagents are still being processed through trials, still being conditioned with trigger phrases and implanted thought forms, still being prepared for the moment when they will be recalled and delivered to whatever machine comes after the morphogenic engine. The Outlast Trials ends with uncertainty about whether you escaped or were released, whether you are free or dormant, whether the trials are over or simply waiting for the next phase. The connection to the Walrider suggests the answer is that nothing ends. You graduate from one level of horror to another, Sinyala to deployment to rebirth, conditioning to activation to transformation, person to weapon to component of something that wears consciousness like clothes and discards it just as easily. The Skinner Man is watching. He wears Easterman's face, but he is also Vernika's creation, the template for the Walrider, the demon that proves human consciousness can be harvested and weaponized. And somewhere in the black tendrils that kill at Mount Massive, fragments of Sinyala's victims still exist, screaming without voices, aware of what they have become, but unable to die because their consciousness has been scattered across technology that will not let them rest. That is rebirth. That is the mystery's answer. You do not escape Murkoff. You become the weapon they always intended you to be. And when you finally achieve the transformation they promised, when you are finally reborn into something greater than human limitation, you discover that greater means worse, and transformation means death prolonged indefinitely through technology that turns consciousness into ammunition. The Walrider is what awaits at the end of every trial. The mystery is how many more reagents will be destroyed before Murkoff finally achieves whatever comes after this. What new horror they are building from the fragments of minds that believed they were volunteering for something that would make them better. Chapter 7. The Mysteries That Remain. We have traced the Skinner Man to his origin as an implanted thought form and prototype for the Walrider. We have found the escaped reagent in the gap between memory and documentation. Discovered program Geister's experiments in making people function as ghosts inside others' perception. We have identified the thallium poisoning Easterman and recognized Wernicke's grooming as the mechanism that transforms researchers into instruments of their own destruction. We have decoded Spider Eye Lamb as the trigger phrase that activates dormant programming. And we have followed rebirth to its terrible conclusion in the morphogenic engine, where reagents become components of consciousness-based weapons. But mysteries remain, questions the game poses without answering, gaps in the narrative that resist resolution even after examining every document and timeline entry. Who is Amelia Collier, really? Is she a former reagent who escaped and now helps others? Or is she a Murkoff operative running a program designed to identify which subjects retain too much resistance to be deployed? The escape trial could be genuine freedom or another layer of psychological manipulation. We cannot verify which interpretation is correct because the evidence supports both equally. What happened to the other prime assets? We know Coyle, Gooseberry, Franco Barbie, but documents reference additional prime assets whose identities remain obscured. Did they die during programs that went wrong? Were they deployed like reagents, activated in the field for objectives we never see? Or do they remain at facilities beyond Sinyala, still running trials decades later, still destroying minds while believing they serve necessary purposes? How many facilities exist beyond Sinyala and Mount Massive? The timeline suggests Murkoff operates multiple locations, different experiments, different directors, different populations of victims processed through variations on the same fundamental techniques. The trials never end because when one facility closes, another opens. When one program fails, another begins. The research continues because Murkoff has built an institutional structure that transcends individual facilities and individual researchers. What is Murkoff's ultimate objective? Creating sleeper agents explains Sinyala. Developing consciousness-based weapons explains Mount Massive. But the timeline extends further. Outlast 2 introduces new horrors, new experiments, suggestions that Murkoff's research has applications beyond Cold War espionage and military weapons. Are they attempting to control populations, reshape consciousness on a social scale, create post-human entities that will replace human civilization entirely? The answer remains deliberately obscured. These mysteries are not accidents. They are features of how the Outlast Trials constructs its narrative. The game understands that uncertainty is more disturbing than resolution, that questions without answers create dread that persists long after definitive explanations would be forgotten. You cannot dismiss what you cannot fully understand. You cannot escape what you cannot clearly identify. The biggest mystery is not what Murkoff did. It is what they are still doing, whether the experiments continue, whether reagents are being processed right now through trials that refine techniques perfected at Sinyala, whether you could be targeted for recruitment, whether the advertisements could appear in your unemployment office or your hospital or your prison, whether you could become the next person waking on a bench with metal goggles bolted to your skull and no clear memory of how you volunteered for this. That possibility transforms the Outlast Trials from historical horror into present tense threat. The game is set in 1959, but the techniques are timeless. The psychological principles that make Project Lathe effective, the pharmaceutical interventions that disrupt memory and enhance suggestibility, the architectural designs that disorient and control, all of these elements exist in the real world. They are not science fiction. They are documented methods used by actual institutions for purposes that range from military training to political control to commercial manipulation. Murkoff is fiction. The principles they use are not, and the game's greatest achievement is making you recognize those principles in context beyond the game itself, making you see how institutional structures manipulate consciousness in ways most people never consciously register. The mystery is not what happens inside Sinyala. The mystery is how many Sinyalas exist in the real world, hidden behind corporate names and government clearances, processing people through systems designed to break and rebuild consciousness according to specifications that serve power rather than human well-being. You cannot answer that question by playing the game. The game can only show you what to look for, what patterns indicate that institutional manipulation is occurring, what signs suggest that someone is being processed through trials they did not consent to and do not fully understand. The Outlast Trials teaches you to recognize the machinery. What you do with that recognition is up to you. Here's what Red Barrels understood that most horror developers miss. The scariest thing about institutional evil is not what it does to you. It is that you can never be certain it stopped. Murkoff does not need to keep you imprisoned at Sinyala because they already installed the prison inside your head. The uncertainty about whether you escaped or were released, whether your memories are real or manufactured, whether 3 words could transform you into someone else entirely. That uncertainty is more effective than any physical restraint. This is why the mysteries matter more than their solutions. Knowing who poisoned Easterman would not change what the thallium reveals about how Murkoff treats even their most valuable researchers. Confirming whether the escaped reagent existed would not eliminate the possibility that Program Geister can erase people from your memory. Understanding exactly what Spider Eye Lamb activates would not protect you from activation because the programming exists beneath conscious awareness. The mysteries are not puzzles waiting to be solved. They are demonstrations of how thoroughly Murkoff has colonized the space between what you know and what you can verify. And that colonization is the real horror. Not the trials themselves, but the aftermath. The permanent condition of suspecting that your own consciousness has been compromised in ways you cannot detect or resist. Reagents who survive Sinyala spend the rest of their lives unable to trust their own minds. Every gap in memory could be activation. Every unusual impulse could be programming. Every certainty about who they are could be a lie Murkoff installed so convincingly that it feels like personal truth. The game never tells you whether this paranoia is justified or whether it is another layer of conditioning designed to make you police yourself. That ambiguity is deliberate. It teaches the same lesson Murkoff teaches its reagents. You cannot trust anything, including the part of you that evaluates trustworthiness. The call is coming from inside your own skull, and you will never be able to verify whether the voice you hear as your own thoughts actually belongs to you or to the people who rebuilt your consciousness according to their specifications. So the Skinner Man keeps rising from floors you thought were solid. Spider Eye Lamb keeps waiting in conversations you will have years from now, and the Walrider keeps killing using fragments of people who believed they were strong enough to survive what Murkoff did to them. The mysteries do not resolve because resolution would imply an ending, and Murkoff never built anything designed to end. They built systems that reproduce, that spread, that turn victims into vectors who carry the conditioning forward into contexts where it looks like normalcy instead of weaponized trauma. That is what you carry out of Sinyala. Not answers, but the permanent inability to stop asking questions about your own reality. And somewhere Murkoff is counting that as success.